The second kind of argument, which Chomsky, he only sort of hints at in the text that you read, but is one that's very famous that's come out of his work, is what's called the poverty of stimulus argument. And the poverty of stimulus argument, well, let me start by saying what the conclusion of the argument is. The conclusion of the argument is that, at least when it comes to the rules of grammar, a lot of what people know when they know a language is actually innate. A lot of the rules of grammar, or certain important elements of them, are not learned. They're sort of the child who learns language knows them all along. Something to be clear about this. So Chomsky is not saying like we innately know all of language. Like he certainly thinks that when we grow up and we learn to speak, that a certain amount of what we know when we know language is learned, and it comes from looking at other people. But he thinks that there are certain important elements of language learning which are not learned as well. There are some that are innate. So why think this? Like, why think that there are some elements of language learning which are innate? Well, basically the reason is that it turns out the rules of grammar for any language are really incredibly complicated. I'll show you an example of this in a moment. But not only are they incredibly complicated, even though they're incredibly complicated, children pick them up very quickly. And in fact, they pick them up so quickly, it looks very hard to maintain, Chomsky thinks, that what they're doing is that they're like seeing a bunch of evidence and they're figuring out the right rule. So let me give you some examples. Let's just take the sentence written on the board. Ecuador is in South America. The particular kind of rule that we're going to focus on very quickly here is the rule of how you form questions in English. So if you're given a sentence, that's like a sentence for what we call a declarative sentence, which says that something is the case. How do you turn that into a question? So take the example here. Ecuador is in South America. How do you turn that into a question? Well, you might have thought that the answer to this is very obvious. You might have thought the obvious answer is just you flip these two around. You just take the first verb you find, and you put that at the front of the sentence. But actually, when we look at some more complicated examples, we see that the actual rule has to be much more complicated. It can't be that you simply find the verb and put it at the front. So let's take this sentence. That woman who is walking her dog is my neighbor. That's a sentence. How do we turn that sentence into a question? Well, remember the rule we were entertaining. The rule we were entertaining said, well, you go and you find the first verb, and you just put that at the beginning of the sentence. Well, that would say, well, we take this verb, and we put it at the front. But this is not right, because if that rule were right, then the question form of this would say, is that woman who walking her dog is my neighbor? And that's obviously complete nonsense. The string of words, is that woman who walking her dog is my neighbor, that's just not a sentence of English at all. So this very simple rule we thought about of just flipping the first verb and the subject around is not right. That is not how question formation works. Obviously, how we actually do it is that we don't look at this one. We look at this is, and we move that to the front. So the way you really say the question is that woman who is walking her dog my neighbor? So what we do is we find some verb later on in the sentence and we move that to the front. But this then raises a question. Why is it that we know, or how is it that we know that we don't look at the first one we find? Why do we know that we have to look for one later on? The explanation for this gets kind of complicated, so I'm not going to go into the details too much. So you shouldn't feel like you totally understand the explanation completely, because I'm not giving you the whole explanation. But here, very, very roughly, is the gist of it. There's an idea of what linguists call the main clause. And here, so a clause is something like a sentence, or very close to it. And here, the important thing is that even though there's a verb here, there's an is here, it's inside this who is walking her dog bit. And the fact that it's inside this who is walking her dog, under the who, means it's not part of the main clause. What we call the main clause contains this part here, the is my neighbor bit. Because if you think about it, the who is walking her dog, that's sort of kind of like an aside to the main sentence. The real action, the main action of the sentence is happening in this bit. So even this is probably too simple, but something like a better rule is that the verb you put at the front is the verb that you find in the main clause. As I said, even that is probably not right, but it's probably more complicated than that. But even this rule is complicated enough. But to know what this rule says, you need to understand this idea of the main clause. And this idea is kind of complicated. Like, I haven't even really fully explained it to you guys just now. I've just sort of given you an impression of it. And yet, it looks like it's something that implicitly you're able to do. Because if I asked you, like, what's the question that corresponds to this, you would immediately be able to figure it out. It doesn't take any work for you, given your understanding of language, once you understand what you're being asked to do. But if we think about the rule that you must actually be following, it looks like that rule is really quite complicated. The rule is not anything as simple as just flip the order around. It's something much more complicated, like find the main clause, look at the verb there, and then move that to the front. But that requires you to know, for instance, like what a main clause is and how to distinguish a main clause from these other things which we call subordinate clauses. So it looks like the actual rule is really quite complicated. So that's the first fact that underlies the poverty of stimulus argument, that the rules of grammar of English are really actually quite complicated in the end. This is just really scratching the surface. The second fact is that even though they're very complicated, we're able to understand them. And not only do we come to understand our languages, not only do we come to know these rules of grammar, but we come to do it in a relatively short space of time. Like, it turns out that children master these rules really quite quickly. And this combination is kind of hard to explain if you think that all language learning comes from just observing other people. Because on the one hand, it turns out that the actual facts are really pretty complicated. Like, the facts about how to form a question are pretty complicated, and the rule for explaining them has to be fairly sophisticated. But not only is there a lot of sophistication in what the child has to understand, they also don't get a lot of evidence in the first place, or at least by the time they've mastered it, they still haven't seen a lot of evidence in the grand scheme of things. Like, within a number of years, they're able to come to master this very complicated rule. And the idea of the poverty of stimulus argument is that this is pretty hard to explain if what you think is going on is that children are observing people and they're formulating rules, or they're coming up with hypotheses on this basis, because the hypothesis has to be pretty complicated and they have to come up with it pretty quickly. It's better explained, people like Chomsky think, if really the child sort of implicitly comes to the table already knowing some general principles about what the rules of language are going to look like. If in some sense they know that these are the kinds of rules to look for, or if in some sense they come already understanding the concept of a main clause and of a subordinate clause, then these rules are going to be much more easy to figure out if they already know these things, and they're not things they have to pick up by observing people using language. So that's a very quick overview of the poverty of stimulus argument. We're going to probably see it again when we talk about Chomsky later on, but that gives you the flavor of the argument, that certain facts about grammar are very complicated, people pick them up very quickly nevertheless, and so a lot of people conclude there must be some innate element in knowledge of language. But remember, we're talking about Wittgenstein, so how does all this relate to what we were talking about with Wittgenstein? Well, again, I think there's kind of a tension, something of a tension between the way that Wittgenstein is thinking about language learning and the way that the poverty of stimulus argument paints language learning. Because remember, on Wittgenstein's idea, there's sort of just, we use language in particular ways, we go out into the world, we sort of get inducted into these practices, we learn these practices of like what happens when you say a particular sentence, or how to achieve some desired effect with a particular sentence. And that's all there is to language learning. But the poverty of stimulus argument seems to paint a much more complicated picture of how language learning works. On the poverty of stimulus picture, well, actually, language is a very special thing. Unlike lots of other things, we come to the table already knowing a lot about some of the important concepts of, for example, like grammar. Like, we come to the table knowing things like the notion of the subordinate clause or the main clause, or the examples we talked about before. And that really, I mean, the tension is a little bit harder to spell out. Like, it's not a direct, if there's some work in saying, like, what exactly is the incompatibility. It's partly because, it's hard to pin down the details of Wittgenstein's own view. But I hope you'll agree that there is some felt tension between these two different ways of thinking about language. And again, it corresponds to this idea of systematicity. There's sort of a fundamental, underlying the picture, underlying the poverty of stimulus picture is, again, this idea that there are just certain kind of rules of language, rules of grammar, certain important notions of grammar, and we know them and we use them to understand all these different kinds of sentences. That kind of systematic picture of language does again seem to be kind of at odds with the fundamentally unsystematic picture that Wittgenstein was giving us.